edition of On the Trail of Delusion, where I try to separate the wheat from the chaff and actually try to give you something substantial on the JFK assassination. My guest today is author Gus Russo, who is coming back for his second appearance on the Trail of Delusion. Gus has been an investigative journalist for over 30 years. He's written 9 nonfiction books. He's had 5 optioned for films. He's written 3 books on the JFK assassination, which I heartily recommend, including this book here, Live by the Sword. Absolutely fantastic and essential. And the book we'll talk about mostly today is Brothers in Arms, which is really a must-read. If you haven't read it, pick it up. It's really, really worthwhile. So welcome, Gus Russo.
Hey, thanks, Fred. Nice to see you again.
Yeah, good to see you. So look, I want to talk a lot about what's in this book, and there's so much in here. It's a very, very thick book full of a ton of information. But it's also, there's a lot of stuff in here that conspiracy folks probably aren't aware of, and it's the relationship between the Kennedy brothers and, in this case, the Castro brothers. So if you want to give us a synopsis of what you cover in this book.
Oh boy, a synopsis of 600 pages.
Yeah.
Good first question.
Yeah. And you have 30 seconds.
Well, essentially, since I wrote Live by the Sword, which is about the Cuban politics around the case, that was in the late 90s, 98, I believe. And I learned a lot more since then, obviously, talking to people and doing interviews. But mostly, I'd done a film with German public television, big investigation. I'd done 6 or 7 documentaries on the case as documentary specials, and mostly here, but a few overseas. And the Germans put up a lot of money for research, which they don't do here anymore in the States. They gave us a year, like Frontline did, to go around and find what we could. They took a huge gamble. We didn't know what we'd find. And a lot of the spade work was done by Willie Huisman, who was the lead on it. I helped him write it and gave him a lot of research. But the whole point was Cuba. We were going to do a deep dive on Cuba in regards to the assassination that no network in America had ever done. They gave us over $1 million. Wow. Not me, but the budget was over $1 million. And so we really could go, like Frontline, we could go where we wanted, do what we wanted. I think we went, not me, but I went on some of the trips, but Willie went to, I think, five or six countries to meet sources. I mean, all over, deep sources. And we put some stuff together that I wish more people had read the book, because there's a lot of new material in it that was not available before. And Willie Huisman, he is kind of the Cy Hirsch of Germany. This guy is one of the best investigators. The films he's done and the research on other projects is kind of mind-blowing. So it was an honor to work with him. He had intelligence sources all over the world, deep inside the KGB, inside Cuba, in Latin America. And he spoke fluent Spanish and Portuguese, and he was the guy for this story. So I said, I'm all in. He had won every award you could win in Europe as an investigator. Anyway, so Brothers in Arms emanates from what we learned in that project in 2005 and 2006. Willie went to Cuba a number of times. We both went to Mexico City. He went more than I did. He went to Vienna to meet KGB sources, and who would meet him in a third country. He had a source inside the KGB that had helped him on previous projects, well trusted. And we asked him, we called him Nikolai. We asked him to go into the encrypted files of the KGB files. And we gave him a couple names. We gave him Oswald. We might have given him a Cuban name or something. And we said, we didn't tell him what exactly to look for. We just said, any files you can get with these names, get them. And he didn't know much about the case. He didn't care. Back in those days, you should know that the Russian economy was so bad. $1,000 went a long way. And so this guy took his life in his hands for a year for $1,000.
Wow.
And then he found whatever he found, he would meet Willie in a third country. And there's a little scene in the film where we depict that and show him what he had himself, not even understanding the importance of some of the files he was given to us. So that's one of the major things. And then I had some of the papers that I was given by Marty Underwood, who was a confidant of LBJ's, and he lived near me here in Maryland, and I knew him pretty well. And he had papers that he said were given to him by notes he made of an interview with Win Scott, the station chief in Mexico City. And those papers talked about the guy who met Oswald in Mexico City, which was a big thrust of our investigation. And it was Fabian Escalante, according to Marty's handwritten notes from his meeting with Win Scott in 1968. So we went down, or Willie went down, turned the camera on, and interviewed Fabian. And they say, "What's your side of this story?" And we caught him in a number of lies. So that's the other part of it. The station in Germany hired a full-time investigator in Mexico City for us, a PI, to track down employees of the Cuban embassy who were there in 1963, and we found 3 or 4 of them. It's incredible. Wow. And they said, "What took you guys so long to come down here and talk to us?" I said, "Well, I couldn't get an American network to care about Mexico City. All they wanted was the grassy knoll, you know." Right. And I had to go to Germany. I mean, the secret to my sort of adventure in this case is, I guess I was good at finding other people to finance my research. Right. So I knew how to get networks, you know, wherever I could find them. Anyway, so this was German money, and they paid for this PI to find these people, and then we'd film them. So, you know, that's how it all got going. And what we learned from that project, which was phenomenal, kind of mind-blowing to me, that turned into Brothers in Arms, because we could only use, as with any documentary, we could only use a fraction of it in an hour-and-a-half film, and we had miles of information that had to be known. So that's where Brothers in Arms came from.
So tell me a bit, I mean, before we get into Escalante, but let's back up and just talk a bit about what was going on between the Kennedys and the Castros. Because if you listen to a lot of the conspiracy theorists, all they'll talk about is rapprochement. Kennedy wanted to make nice with Cuba. Castro wanted to make nice with Kennedy. It was all going to be lovey-dovey, and then Kennedy was killed. And so we don't really get a flavor of what was really going on between the two countries. So how about talking a bit about the relationship between the Kennedys and the Castros?
Yeah, that's the question, isn't it? Okay, my modus operandi, my life has always been to go to the source, right? I read the books, but you know, whatever. I was never satisfied. I had to find a way to find enough money to go talk to the people, and so that's how I've always operated. Now it's hard to do because they're all dead. Most of them are gone. But back then, in the 80s and 90s and 2000s, you could find the people and get the story. So I spent a lot of time in Miami with Cuban exiles to get their version of this. New Orleans, I practically lived there in the 90s. And the other thing I did, I think, was a good choice, was I joined this group, AFIO, the Association of Former Intelligence Officers, which had thousands of members across the country. And I would go to their luncheons every 3 or 4 months, and there was hundreds of them there. All the famous people were there, and I got to know them this way for about 10 years. Right. And they trusted me. My point is, I wanted to get that Cuba story from every possible angle I could, from the federal employees, the agencies, from the Cubans on the ground, everything I could. I wanted to get it from them. People who think the Kennedys weren't at war with Cuba haven't spoken to anybody, frankly. You know, it's overwhelming. Every executive, every in Washington, every intelligence, every FBI person, they all thought one thing: this is all about Cuba. They never spoke about the mob killing Kennedy or the CIA or the oil people. They knew this was Cuba. And it became clear to me that if there was a cover-up, this is what it was, because everybody believed this when you talk to first-hand people. Okay, it was all about Oswald, who he knew in Mexico, who he didn't know. And as far as the Kennedys go, to get to your question, these people all knew the Kennedys. There was 2 things going on. There was a personal grudge between the Kennedy brothers and the Castro brothers. That's why I called it Brothers in Arms.
Right.
the evidence is kind of overwhelming, especially if you go to the early works by Schlesinger and people like that, that the the Kennedys were so embarrassed by the Bay of Pigs that it became a personal thing. Sammy Halpern and other people at the agency told me many times that they couldn't get past this personal grudge. This was not about national security. And then you talk to people like Al Haig, who was in the Pentagon, or Joe Califano, who was in the Pentagon, and who else? People who knew the Kennedys personally. The other component was that the Kennedys were terrified of losing the 64 election. So acting on Cuba had to be done. The Republicans, if you look it up the history, if you read the newspapers from 62 and 63, they were calling the Kennedys out. You're soft on Castro, you know, and they had to make a move on Cuba before the 64 election and show that they were tough because the Kennedys were very hawkish. People forget that when it came to Cuba. And so it was personal. After the Bay of Pigs, Castro took a world tour and made a point of embarrassing the Kennedys at every stop, calling them the cretins of the world. Little Cuba beat the Kennedys, and the Kennedys weren't used to that, to losing, you know.
Right.
And so it became a thing where it was a combination of politics and of a personal grudge. None of it had anything to do with security concerns. And this drove the CIA guys crazy. And I interviewed all of them, from Shackley to Colby to Helms to Halpern and on and on. They all said that this made no sense. It wasn't their idea to have this war against Castro, but they were ordered to do it. And Bill Harvey, he was part of it. And they did it. And so that's the Cuba thing. And there's no doubt in my mind, even when we interviewed Kubela in Madrid, he told us Bobby Kennedy knew about his operation. It's on film. It's in my book. And how did that escape all these people, all these researchers, all these years? Kubela, and also one of the other guys who was at AFIA, who I used to have lunch with, was the man who was referred to for decades as the case officer. They would never divulge his name. Amlash's case officer, or Cabela. It was Nestor Sanchez. Of course, now everybody knows it. But Nestor Sanchez told me the same thing. He said, "Oh yeah, the Kennedys knew everything." And
so
Richard Helms told me. I used to walk Richard
right.
Helms to his car after all these luncheons, and he told me all these stories about, Bobby was on top of all this. He was the energy behind Mongoose and the plots and everything else. So anyway, I'm rambling on.
Well, no, that just brings me. We have Operation Mongoose, and we have Northwoods, and all the sabotage against Castro. And to the conspiracy theorists, they would say, "Well, that was the CIA acting on their own against the wishes of the Kennedys."
Well, yeah. Well, they know nothing about how the CIA works. And if you look at the documents closely, you'll see in many of the key situations, and whoever's writing the document will say this was approved by a higher authority on such and such a date. Well, higher authority is code for the president. Okay. And, you know nothing about how the CIA works if you think they would, on their own, murder a foreign leader. It's absurd. They
Right.
just, and so these people claim to be experts. They just don't know how this stuff works. And I only know because I've interviewed so many of them, and they're not all liars. That, and their agency wouldn't exist if they went around the world killing people.
One thing that really struck me in your book, Brothers in Arms, is the picture in the book of them in Havana parading a coffin of JFK. I think is in 1962. I'm not sure the exact date.
Right.
But
Yeah.
people sometimes, I mean, these days, sometimes people think back at Castro. Oh, he was a nice old man. Really,
Hmm.
really grandfather, nice uncle. But they sort of forget that he was sort of a fiery communist back in the early 60s.
Oh God, he and Che Guevara murdered so many people. I mean, they were horrible. I know he's been portrayed as this romantic hero, and young people wear Che Guevara T-shirts and stuff. But Che personally got a thrill out of murdering teenage kids, putting them up against the firing squad. Uh, and this is the kind of thing you get by hanging with the Cubans and looking at the documents. There was so much detail information about this, I couldn't even fit it in the book. So as you may know, I put a website up thanks to Gordon Winslow in Miami. He helped me with that, where I put all my evidence of the history of Cuban terrorism on this website. And you could see around the world, all documented, who these people really were. There are people who say, oh, Castro would never kill anybody. And I'm not saying he killed Kennedy, far from it. But people who say, oh, Castro would never be involved in things like this, they don't know Castro. They were not good boys. They got drunk with power. He may have started in the early 50s as a romantic revolutionary to get rid of this corrupt Batista, but it went to his head. And there were a lot of murders, and yeah, a lot of families were torn apart. And so that's who Castro was. And yeah, so is that the answer to that question? I mean, that's what you get from knowing these people, and doing the work.
Yeah, and I think people just forget about what type of person he was back when he was giving those 7-hour speeches of venom in Havana.
Well, getting to that casket picture that you talked about, I had read about that in a footnote. I think it was from Ralph Dungan, a White House aide to JFK. He had written some big FBI report, and in a little footnote, there was a thing about this photograph. And so I was bound and determined to track it down. And I actually there was one picture copy of it in a magazine that was in Havana. And I had a friend down there at the time who smuggled that picture out of the library for me.
Right.
I mean, I told you this. And but the casket, they're parading a giant casket, and it says, "Here lies President Kennedy, murdered by the Cuban Revolution," on it. And Castro and Che are up there at the dais applauding and clapping and cheering, and there's tens of thousands of people
Right.
in the square, and they're all just cheering the murder of Kennedy by the Cuban Revolution. I just put that in there. It doesn't prove anything. It does show what these people felt about President Kennedy.
Yeah, no, it's a striking photograph, and I think that was, I mean, when I read your book, I mean, I knew a lot of the enmity between them, but boy, it really comes out in your book in a huge way. And it's very important background information that anybody studying the assassination should know about.
Yeah, I agree with you. Thank you. It's certainly what practically everybody in Washington believed, from Lyndon Johnson on down. They were terrified of this Cuban stuff because they all knew the relationship, who Castro was, and the relationship between the Kennedys and him. It was like playing with fire, the whole time.
And there's a quote that you have on the back of Live by the Sword. On the back cover, you have a quote from Robert Kennedy from 1968. I have wondered at times if we did not pay a very great price for being more energetic than wise about a lot of things, especially Cuba.
And there's a lot. I've found some more quotes by him along those lines that are mind-blowing. He knew the good part of Bobby Kennedy is he changed, but it took his brother's death to do it. He realized that they had made huge mistakes in both Vietnam and Cuba, and he said that. I've got the exact quotes, which I'll be happy to send you, where he talked about his running for president in '68. I'm convinced was to undo the mistakes he made when he was young, and he made big ones. And when he says in that quote, "We made a lot of mistakes, especially regarding Cuba," well, what could that be? He's talking about Jack's death, and he knew.
And I'm struck by the fact that he didn't tell the Warren Commission anything about the plots against Castro. I mean, I find it funny. Everybody says, "Oh my God, Allen Dulles didn't say a word about the plots to the Warren Commission," but neither did RFK.
Well, who put Allen Dulles on the Warren Commission?
Yeah.
Robert Kennedy.
Yeah, but I'm struck that after the Warren report came out, when people were talking to Robert Kennedy, and he knew. I mean, he must have thought, "Oh my God, there's a Cuban angle here, and I can't talk about it." But and he knew that there was something. The Warren report may have been fine, but there were issues because he had not told them everything he knew.
Well, I think a big part of all of that was preserving the legacy and the martyrdom of JFK. If
Right.
this had come out, this idea of they lived by the sword and died by the sword, there wouldn't be all this, Kennedy half dollars and Kennedy high schools, and the whole thing uh, is based on a myth that he was a poor innocent guy who never did anything wrong and he got shot by this lunatic. No, he made mistakes, and Bobby did too. So I think him not talking, he was in that bind of he wanted to undo the mistakes he had made, but he was not going to talk about them in any detail because his brother's legacy, the JFK Library, all this stuff, it never would have happened. So that's where I think Bobby Kennedy's head was at that point in his life. And yeah, he turned down the Warren Commission 2 or 3 times. They asked him to testify, but I've got 3 or 4 sources now, including a government document that talks about how he was the one who put Allen Dulles, a close family friend. Forget what they say about Dulles hating the Kennedys. He loved the Kennedys, and vice versa. And I interviewed Dulles' sister. I went in New Mexico, Joan. I interviewed his nephew. Spoke to a lot of his friends, and there's no doubt of the friendship between the Kennedy and Dulles. After the Bay of Pigs, which he was allegedly fired for, but he wasn't, and Kennedy took him to Langley to dedicate the new building, gave him the National Intelligence Medal. This is after they hated each other so much, And I've read all the letters at Princeton between Dulles and Bobby Kennedy, and it was like a love affair. He was a kindly uncle who they just looked up to, and he was going to preserve that myth inside the Warren Commission. They didn't have to know. The feeling was, Jack's dead. This is not going to bring him back, to tell all this dirt. So
Yeah.
let's leave sleeping dogs lie, and that's how they looked at it. But this idea that Dulles hated the Kennedys is absolutely absurd, absolutely absurd. Um, and he loved Jackie. Oh my God, he and Jackie were very tight, Dulles, and their communications are available. So
And
what can
then
you
the
say?
thought that he hated Kennedy and he killed him.
Yeah,
Is
right.
yeah,
Yeah.
I don't like him. I'm going to kill him.
Unbelievable, unbelievable. Uh, no, it's upside down. We live in a post-truth world, as you well know, so
Yeah.
it's hard to get people to read the biographies of Allen Dulles and to look at his papers. And now it's impossible to talk to anybody because they're all gone. But back in the day, you could look these people in the eye and ask them questions, and they would tell you. Um, but the Dulles thing is lunacy.
So let's talk a bit about, Oswald in Mexico City. If you want to tell us a bit of what you think, what happened in Mexico City.
Couple of the people that we spoke to who were in the Cuban embassy when Oswald was there told us more details than we had heard before. Uh, I think Oswald did go down there to try to find his way to Havana. He wanted to go to Havana, not Russia. And according to all the sources that we were able to put together, and if I could summarize it, he was rebuffed at the Cuban embassy, just like they say, because they didn't know who he was at first. When Sylvia Duran didn't know who this guy was when he walked in, he thought they would know who he was because he had sent his CV down to Mexico City before he went down. And he brought his newspaper clippings with him to show what a great loyalist he was to the revolution. Anyway, when they initially rebuffed him, he flipped out. And at one point, he went back and forth a few times. What the CIA wasn't aware of was that, and this is what the insiders told us who worked in the embassy, although the CIA had the place covered in cameras and they had actual microphones implanted in the furniture, and the Cubans knew all this, and they knew exactly where the dead spots were in the photo coverage. And this guy said, we knew where. This one guy, I think his name was Antonio. We gave him the name Antonio. He said, we knew all that stuff. He said, why? Because Barrios, the guy who ran Winscott's stuff for him, was a loyalist to Fidel. And he told these guys everything. And so he was one of Fidel's best friends. This is a big, important thing. Fernando, I think it was Gutierrez Barrios, was very much close to Fidel. And he was working for Winscott, doing all the surveillance of the Cuban embassy. Anyway, they knew everything. And the CIA people will tell you, yeah, they knew everything. So there was a garage that after they decided we have to talk to this guy, when he flipped out and said, "I'll murder that bastard Kennedy for you," which he did say inside the Cuban embassy on a subsequent visit, they say, "Whoa, let's sit down with this guy and see what he's talking about." So they met him in the garage, which wasn't covered by microphones or cameras. And we spoke to the security guy who was there that day and said, I was given instructions to look out, this guy's going to come, let him in. And we spoke to the guy on the inside who spoke with Oswald. Anyway, the idea was Oswald wanted to prove himself to the revolution. He said, I'll kill Kennedy. They didn't hire him. Castro didn't hire him. Now, I've never said that, although, I've been misinterpreted. Gus thinks Castro killed Kennedy. No, Oswald offered to do it. And these guys, the Cubans, are thinking, well, Kennedy's been trying to kill our guy for the last couple of years. Why not? You take a shot. What do we care? Maybe you'll get lucky. And they offered him money. They told us that he didn't want money. It was about ideology. And I think they gave him $100 or something. One guy said to just go to the bullfights or whatever you're going to do. And but it wasn't a big thing with him. So it was Oswald's idea. They encouraged him. They knew there'd be an attempt made. And I don't think they really even thought the guy was going to pull it off. But their big role in this was to zip their lips and not tell anybody. That's, in my opinion, that's the story in Mexico City. And then he did it. Now, the other part is, I mean, if I mentioned this to you before, I don't know. But one of the guys told us that, one of the Cubans in Mexico told us that, well, actually, one of our best sources who handled Oswald's file in Havana told us that they were going to pick Oswald up in Dallas. They had Cubans in town that flew in, and they were going to pick him up. And they told Oswald that we will take you to Havana and you'll be a hero if you pull this off. Of course, he got caught thanks to Tippit, giving his life to slow down Oswald and everything, but he never made his rendezvous. Well, the Cubans told us, they kind of, this one guy, he laughed. He said, we were never going to take him to Havana. We were going to throw him in the Gulf of Mexico. That's what their plan was if he succeeded. Now, I don't know how much of that is accurate or true. We didn't have a lot of sources for that. But this one guy was very adamant that we did have people in Dallas that day. And I think it might have been the Redbird thing. Who knows? The Redbird Airport. But Oswald never showed up. They were going to kill him anyway if they got him. So
how much of this did the Americans know about in 1964? During the investigation, what happened? And
well, you remember from my first book, you may remember one of the best interviews about that was from Lawrence Keenan, the FBI agent who was sent down to Mexico City the day after the assassination because they already knew Oswald had been there. And they sent him right down. He was the only guy who spoke Spanish very well in the Bureau, and he was available. So they sent him down to Mexico City. Well, he gets down there, and this will tell you what they knew and what they didn't want to know. He gets to his hotel, and there's a message from Hoover saying, Lyndon Johnson, the president has said that you should not do anything while you're down there. Don't talk to anybody. Stay in your hotel for 3 days and come back. This is while the trail is hot. Okay, that's because Johnson didn't want to know what he thought he knew. He was told, according to some CIA sources, he was told orally what had gone on. That on November 22nd, that night in the old executive office building, Johnson was told that there's a lot of dirt in Mexico City about Oswald and Cuban intelligence. Johnson had his own sources in Mexico, and I talk about that in my books. He was a Texan who went to Mexico a lot. He knew that president of the country who ran intelligence for a while, and he had his own sources. And I can imagine the phones burning up that night between him and Mexico, and which is what I'm told happened. And he was getting all this, uncorroborated stuff about Oswald and Cubans, and that was enough to stop it. Johnson told Marty Underwood, I don't want my first act in office to be to start World War III. And he said, we're not doing Mexico. We're not doing Cuba. This whole Murder Incorporated thing, Johnson didn't agree with it. Nobody agreed with it except the Kennedys. And so that was it. A decision was made. Johnson was willing to take the brunt of a cover-up in order to not start a world war. You have to remember, this was exactly 1 year after the Cuban Missile Crisis. So people today who weren't around then have no idea. I was around, and it was terrifying. 20,000 nukes pointed at each other and locked and loaded. And people were terrified. And Johnson, that was in the front of everybody's mind in November of '63. If we attacked Cuba, it'd be just like, the standoff we had with the Soviets, but worse with the missile crisis. And Johnson was not going to go there. And I'm glad he didn't. Obviously, I'm glad he didn't. And because the public would have demanded, an invasion if they'd have knew about the Cuban connection, whatever it was, that was enough. So that's what played into it. Bobby didn't want the truth to come out because it would tarnish the family forever.
Right, for sure.
So he had reasons. Johnson had reasons. Mexico and the CIA had reasons because they lost track of Oswald in Mexico City. The Soviet, everybody had reasons for covering this up, so they all agreed on one thing: let's not ever tell this, for different reasons. And that's my, conclusion about this whole mission, Gus.
Right, right. Now, how many people and did Oswald? I mean, he also did he actually have a gun when he went to the Soviet embassy? Did you do research on that as well, or?
We interviewed for Frontline. We interviewed all three of the KGB guys who met him there. Yeah, he pulled out a gun there.
Right.
He had a gun there. I don't remember if he took out his gun in Cuban embassy, but he certainly made the boast that I'll kill that bastard Kennedy. And we know that because Castro told us he said that. Castro found out about it in real time, and he got it. He blabbed it to the Childs brothers, who he thought they were the leaders of the Communist Party USA, and he thought they were loyal to the Communist Party, but they were snitches for the FBI. Castro never knew he was telling this big secret to these guys who were reporting to the FBI. And I went to their, they were dead by the time I was doing this. And I went to their case officer at the FBI, Ray Wanell. And I said, Ray, tell me about this. He said, number one, they were the best sources in the history of the FBI for 25 years or more. They were the best. Their reports were perfect. Never caught them in a misstatement or a lie. And I said, well, they said that Castro told them that Oswald made this boast about killing Kennedy in the embassy. And he said, if the Childs brothers said that, you can take it to the bank. Castro said it. So that's how far we would go to try to vet or verify a quote.
Right.
I tracked him down. I tracked Ray down in a retirement home in Virginia, suburban Maryland. And he was gracious enough to talk to me and tell me these guys are the real thing. You can take it to the bank. That Castro said that. There you go.
So who is did they actually get a photograph of Oswald in Mexico City, and who is the person in that who is the mystery person in the photograph?
The mystery person? You mean the guy going into the Russian embassy? The guy first identified?
Right. Yeah. Do we know?
I gave the HSCA had a pretty good guess on who he was, and I put his name in my first book, and I can't recall it now, a Russian fisherman or something. But that was done in, talk about the fog of war. That was done within hours of the assassination. They found out that Oswald had gone in at a certain time, and the only photo they had of somebody going in at that time, a guy, was it. Said, maybe this is him. They didn't say for sure it was him, and they hadn't seen a picture of the real Oswald yet. The guys in Mexico, so they sent this up, but it wasn't. It was a fisherman, I believe, or Russian seaman or something. Anyway, the photograph stuff, and I'm convinced they did that. I interviewed a couple of CIA guys who were mentioned in the HSCA report about that, and they were adamant there were photographs. The problem is they never got to Washington because, again, the man who ran surveillance for Win Scott would have covered that up and destroyed things to protect his real friend, Fidel. I mean, I've got pictures of Barrios, I may have sent this to you, of Barrios and Castro just hugging each other. Castro gave a eulogy Castro gave a eulogy for Barrios when he died. Barrios was the guy who helped Castro start the revolution. He, from Mexico, he was the guy who when Castro was in exile as a young man, he helped him launch the Granma boat back to Havana, and they were friends for life. Well, this is one thing I'll never understand: how Win Scott could hire this man, who was one of the bloodiest, murderous. He ran the murder death squads in Mexico. Barrios, bad guy,
Right, right,
loyal to Fidel, and Win Scott depends on him for surveillance. Jesus God, how could that happen? Anyway, he would have been the guy in the chain that could throw out evidence, tape recordings, photographs. That's my guess. Can't
right.
prove it. But that whole thing was just a cluster that they would, have him doing this. He was he lied Tempo One or something, his code name, well known to the conspiracy people. But they should read books about Barrios and Castro. It's out there, you know. Anyway, that's what I think happened to photographs, tapes, whatever. Uh, and and the CIA, they didn't in real time. We interviewed for Frontline. We interviewed the husband and wife team who did the translation for the CIA, and they told us, they said, we didn't get around to these piles of reel to reel tape in real time. It's not like today. They
Right.
would pile up and behind us, right?
Yeah.
So I think they told us, and I don't quote me on this, but I think they told us they didn't even get around to listening to those tapes till they had to after the assassination. The tapes of their surveillance in the embassies. They
Right.
didn't hear them instantly. There was backlogs, and so that was part of the problem. Then CIA didn't want to be embarrassed about, oh my God, we had this guy, we didn't even listen to the tapes, we didn't get the pictures we thought we had, and so there's agency in embarrassment over this whole thing, and in fact, this is what Win Scott told Marty Underwood years later. Marty Underwood being Johnson's confidant, he told him, pardon my language, but he said, we fucked up with Oswald,
Right. Right.
you know, and and they did,
So
you
what
know.
happened with Marty Underwood and his notes and stuff? Can you tell us a bit about him and
Yeah, I met him through Robert White, who was the great Kennedy collector, who again was a good friend of mine, lived very nearby. And he said, "There's a guy you got to speak to, Gus. He was so close to Johnson, and he lives not far from here in Parkville, and uh, he knows a lot." And so, I called him up. We got together. We started having lunches, uh, and he told me in '68, when this ugly election was going on between Johnson and Bobby Kennedy, who hated each other. Uh, Bobby was going to unleash dirt on LBJ about his scandalous past, and so Johnson was looking for dirt on Bobby. So he asked Marty to go down and speak to his good friend Win Scott, and it was his friend. I've seen the letters between Marty and Win; they were friends. He said, "Go down to Win Scott and find out what he knew about the Cubans and Bobby Kennedy, and if that backfired, that'd be a great weapon to use in the campaign. He got his own brother killed." And so he goes down and meets with Win Scott at a safe house. He took notes, and I said, "You took notes? Where are the notes?" He said, "Well, they're at my sister's house in Dubuque." And uh, I said, "My God, I'd love to see them someday." He said, "Well, maybe." He said, "Well, next time I get back there, I'll think about it." And maybe 5, 6 months later, I get a postcard. Oh, he said there was a guy that Win Scott told him about who was handling Oswald in Mexico City. And I said, "Who was that?" He said, "I can't remember. It's in my notes, maybe." So this is in the early '90s. About 6 months later, I get a postcard from Dubuque, Iowa, where his sister Rose lived. And it said the guy in the notes is Fabian Escalante. And I had never heard this name. I don't think was public knowledge when I heard it. He was a nobody. And I said, Fabian Escalante, oh my God, who's this? So I started researching him. Uh, and so that's how we got onto that. But in fact, I'm in touch with the Underwood family right now. I think I know where those notes are, the whole treasure chest.
wow?
And yeah, I'm trying to get the I spoke to his daughter recently, and she doesn't have them, but I know who does, and it's kind of sketchy if that person will cooperate, but we know where they are, and that would be interesting to see. But he sent me copies of a few pages of his notes, the ones that mention Escalante. He did send me 2 or 3 pages about those on White House stationery. Now, there are people who doubt this, that Marty's a drunk or whatever, and a liar. You know, it's a pretty elaborate lie. The notes are in my sister's in a trunk in my sister's basement in Dubuque, and to come up with the name Fabian Escalante when nobody was talking about him, to talk about his trip to see Win Scott, giving me all his letters, communications with Win. Pretty elaborate for a guy in his 80s who doesn't really want to be part of any of this, to invent all this, and even come up with the forged letters on White
Right.
House stationery. I tend to think it's true.
Right. Right.
You know,
Well, it'd be amazing if you actually managed to get those notes.
I know, wouldn't it? Yeah.
That would be something.
Yeah.
So tell me a bit about, if I believe the conspiracy theorists, well, the whole JFK assassination was masterminded by, well, Bill Harvey is one name that comes to mind. You
Yeah.
you talked to his family. What can you tell us about Bill Harvey?
Well, Bill was a complicated guy for sure. He was a patriot. I mean, you do get that from his family and his own testimony and his records. The guy loved America. He had a drinking problem for sure, and he had a temper, not a murderous temper, just a temper.
Right.
He never killed anybody, but uh, you know, and he knew what Bobby Kennedy was up to, and it drove him nuts. Uh, Bobby, and there's examples in my first book and maybe in the second, about Bobby Kennedy doing everything that was so insecure, operational insecurity, just doing things that were going to leak out. He had Cuban exiles training in his backyard at Hickory Hill. And Harvey's going, Jesus Christ, you can't do this. And it was
Right.
driving him nuts because he built the Berlin Tunnel. He knew about how to do things. And
Right.
would just, bust into CIA JM Wave. He'd go down there and just tear papers out of the teletype, and Harvey would say, "Where the hell are you going with that?" He would tear it out of his hands. So he hated Bobby, not because he was a Kennedy or because he was Bobby, but because he didn't know what he was doing, which Bobby came to realize himself years later.
Right.
And the Kennedys all agree with Bill Harvey, that Kennedy was out of control. And so I interviewed, I spent 2 days in Indianapolis with his widow, and she told me great stories about how much they loved Johnny Roselli. Johnny and Bill were very tight, and she just loved Johnny. And did I tell you about the mongoose, the stuffed mongoose? Did I ever tell you
No,
that?
no, yeah. Go tell us. Yeah, tell the story.
Yeah, well, in the living room of her house, she had a stuffed mongoose, and and it had a banner across its chest. The mongoose was RFK.
No, that's Bill Harvey's widow.
Bill Harvey's widow, yeah, CG, and I met who else did I meet at that? Mark Wyatt, who was his assistant, Harvey's assistant in Rome,
So,
and
so was Harvey in Dallas and on November 22nd?
he was in the fifth floor. He was in the bar on the first floor drinking.
That's right.
No, Bill was in Sardinia,
Right.
and and he said some very impolitic things when he was told JFK was killed, something to the effect of, "Well, it's a good thing that it happened, so we didn't start World War III," kind of thing. And he was dry. He had a hangover, according to Mark Wyatt, from a bender the night before. And so Bill was a character, but he didn't kill Kennedy. He hated Bobby, didn't hate Kennedy, but he just thought that these guys were so in over their head from an operational standpoint. They thought they were spies. Bobby thought he could be a spy. He thought he knew what he was doing. He had no idea what he was doing. And a lot of people in government agreed with that. And that wasn't just Bill Harvey. A lot of people at the CIA thought the same
Now,
thing.
I mean, he was friends with Johnny Roselli. Now, was Johnny Roselli a murderer?
No, never murdered anybody in his life. Johnny wouldn't get his $2,000 silk suits dirty enough to murder anybody. No, Johnny was a deal maker. And I interviewed, God, his family, relatives of his in Miami. I interviewed his stepdaughter, Nancy Czar, who was his closest friend and visited him in prison all the time. And just to get a background on who this guy was, he was a mob deal maker. He never murdered anybody. I don't think he ever tried to murder anybody. He just, except the most violent stuff he did was when he volunteered for Operation Mongoose. And he was, burning down sugarcane plantations or blowing up whatever. That was the most violent stuff I ever heard that he did. But he was well liked, and and he was a patriot. That book, the first biography of him, American Mafioso, All American Mafioso, that's
Right.
a good title. He was a patriotic guy, and that's why he volunteered when this mongoose thing happened. He said, "I'll do it, and I'll do it for free." And here's a 57-year-old guy in speedboats going over to Havana to blow up, sugarcane or whatever. I mean, uh,
Right.
this is not a guy who wants to kill President Kennedy, and I'm fairly sure he said on a number of occasions how much he loved President Kennedy. He certainly didn't know Lee Harvey Oswald and all this stuff. And as we know, Lee Harvey Oswald fired the shots, and I'm sure that's going to get me a lot of grief, but that's kind of a no-brainer, actually.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. But yeah, I mean, they just won't give up on Bill
They won't
Harvey,
give up.
Johnny Roselli. Dave Phillips is a favorite of the conspiracy crowd.
Yeah, yeah.
You met Dave Phillips, right? Didn't you?
No, I didn't. I didn't
Oh,
meet Dave, but I was in that group AFIO, which he had founded, uh, and of course everybody in AFIO was immensely loyal and loved him. And uh, no, of course I read his testimony. I don't think I ever met him, but I certainly read his testimony for the HSCA, and I read the letter that his son wrote to Dale Myers, and this really hurts the Phillips family. That whole shebang about he killed Kennedy and all that garbage, which all comes from the Morris Bishop. We all know where that all started, all that lunacy. Uh, and I say all that lunacy because it skips the elephant in the room, Lee Harvey Oswald.
right.
These guys know more about David Morales than they know about Oswald, which blows my mind.
Yeah,
Uh, and so it's all this stuff around the edges that they conflate, and they won't talk about the guy who was arrested. I mean, really talk about him. And if you do that, this is a bad, bad guy. Beat up his own mother, hated his mother, didn't have a father. He tried to stab his sister-in-law when he was a teenager. Uh, he was diagnosed as practically incurable sociopath when he was 13 years old. We interviewed those people, the psychiatrists for Frontline. They were terrified that this kid is a mess. And, he was violent. He beat Marina so much. I mean, the White Russians that we interviewed down in Texas, they uh, glommed on to Marina, young Marina, because she was black and blue.
right.
That's who this guy was, and they don't want to talk about that. He was a bad, bad guy. He tried to murder Walker. He beat his wife to a pulp on regular occasions, so much she tried to hang herself, and he caught her and beat her again. He beat her in front of people that I interviewed. Um, he murdered Tippit, and of course, that's obvious to us. But
Yeah.
he murdered Kennedy. He was a bad, bad guy, and so I just can't believe you want to know more about Morales than you do about this guy. There's so much on him that tells you who he was, where he was, and that he was a murderous bastard, frankly. When I first met Blakey during the HSCA days, I used to go down to the open hearings, and I got to know the staff, which was really a good kickstart for me. Kevin Walsh and Fonzie, and and I spoke to Blakey, and I said to Blakey at one point, I was able to pull him aside, and I said, "Tell me about this guy Oswald. What's your take on him?" He said, "You know who he was, Gus?" He said, "Oswald was poor white trash." And he
Right.
said, "You could knock on any door in Oak Cliff and find a guy like him." and he had no great love for Lee Harvey. He knew that he shot him. He just thought somebody else was shooting from the front, which was wrong. But he knew Oswald did it. He knew Oswald's history, and so both the Warren Commission and the HSCA agreed Oswald killed Kennedy. The only difference is Blakey got sidetracked by this ridiculous tape that we knew almost immediately was not real.
And then ultimately, Blakey got sidetracked by the whole mob did it angle.
Yeah, he was always looking for the well. When the tape recording came out, as you know, he had that gave him his opening to say, "Oh, so the mob was on the grassy knoll," because he was a mob guy, and there was no evidence at all. He just was dying to say that all along that the mob did it, and it's just crazy. But he knows Oswald fired the shots that killed Kennedy. He just wants to say the mob was there too. They just missed the whole car when they shot from 25 feet away.
Yeah, they took one shot from the grassy knoll and missed.
I asked him that too. I said, Mr. Blakey, I don't understand the logic. You get a world-class mafia hitman on the grassy knoll, and he misses everything. I said, it's not logical. He said, I wasn't asked to do logic. I said,
Right.
Oh, okay.
Right.
So, it's ludicrous. If people think Oswald is innocent with the kind of evidence stacked against him, then I've always said that they should open up the prisons and let just about everybody out, because there was more against him than most of the murderers that are in prison right now. There was a mountain on this guy, not just his past history, but the ballistics, the forensics, the trajectory. The whole HSCA knew it. The whole Warren Commission knew it.
Yep.
The FBI knew it. The CIA knew it. But there's got to be somebody else, because we got to have a conspiracy. So somebody else, even Cyril Wecht knew that the photos of the X-rays of Kennedy's skull showed that he was shot from behind. He knew that. He said it.
He definitely knew it. And I have to believe that the autopsy surgeons, Humes and Boswell, realized really early on in the autopsy, we'll get thinking here, but this is not a hard case. You could see the entrance wound, the exit wound. It's pretty clear cut what happened. It wasn't a difficult case.
Yeah, they knew. In fact, we interviewed them, pre-interviewed them for Frontline. They didn't, Humes and Boswell, and but I don't think they wanted to go on camera at the time. But we frankly weren't doing a ballistics forensics show. We were doing a biography of Oswald.
Right.
And there were so many people that didn't go on camera. I wish we had gotten them, because they were talking, and they lived here in Maryland, and I spoke to them, and they knew how he died. Everybody on the inside knew how he died. It's just people who live. I've often thought that if you live in Maryland or Virginia or DC, where all of these government employees live, you hear one story. And if you live in Dallas or New Orleans, you knew the story. But the further away you get from those places, the more elaborate the conspiracy becomes. If you were in New Orleans, and I practically lived there in the 90s, or in Dallas, same thing, they all know. But when people in Santa Monica, like
New York, the closer you get to Mark Lane, wherever he is,
the further away you get, the more bizarre it gets. But if you're in those towns, I tell you, everybody, I must have interviewed 30 people who knew or worked for Jack Ruby. They all knew why he did it. Every single one of them. If you said he was a mafia guy, they'd have laughed at you. Every one of them.
Yeah.
So, and that really, in New Orleans, people down there know. They knew who Oswald was.
Let me ask you one quick question about the mob, because you're an expert. People should know you're an expert on the mob. And so what do you think of the theories that Carlos Marcello killed Kennedy?
Well, I know something about that. His son is a friend of mine, Joe Marcello, and it's very hurtful to the family, because they're a Catholic family. They were not a murderous mob family. The Marcellos made their money in two ways: gambling. They had a lot of bookies, and real estate.
Right.
This wasn't like what people don't understand about the mafia is every metropolitan area has a different organized crime with an entirely different way of doing business. In New York, it was all these five families killing each other on the front pages every day. Chicago didn't do that. They had violence every 10 years. Something awful would happen, then it'd be quiet for a while. New Orleans, nothing. If you talk to the DAs and the U.S. attorneys in New Orleans, they liked Carlos because he kept those other guys out. He said, one of the, who was it who told me? I can't remember. One of the DAs said that we liked Carlos because he kept the bad guys out. He was the best organized crime you could have if you had to have it. And they all, what's his name? Harry Connick told me he used to go to Carlos's bookies all the time. He said we all used his service. And the women in New Orleans absolutely worship Carlos, and they miss him so much. He did favors for people. He donated to children's hospitals. He was well loved. The family is well loved. I would go around with Joe in the French Quarter, and no matter which great restaurant you would go in, you could not pay if you were with Joe. Oh, Joe, come on in, man. Everybody loved him. And everybody loves him. He's still around. But boy, they really made a killing in real estate. That's where the killing came from. Carlos was very smart to get all this land west of the river that was swampland, and he did what criminals quote unquote do. He got a politician to rezone it for him,
Right.
so to develop it, and made a freaking fortune. When I get a call from Joe, my caller ID says Churchill Farms, because that's still the name of their company. Yeah, the guy who did the best written work on Carlos was, oh God, he wrote the book Payoff. Mike Dorman. He went down and spent. It wasn't all about Carlos, but there was a chapter on Carlos. He went down there and spent a few days with Carlos, and it was a phenomenal interview. And Joe told me that was the best interview ever done with his father, and it's really great. Mike Dorman was a great investigative reporter for Newsday in New York, and he really, like I like to try to do, is first person, travel and meet people.
Right.
And Carlos had a lot of interesting things to say. He told him how he made his fortune and so forth. So no, the Marcellos were not murderers. They liked President Kennedy. They couldn't vote for him because I don't think Carlos was a real citizen. But the family liked JFK, fellow Catholic, and
So what do you think happened with this supposed confession in prison?
he never made it. This guy who was his cellmate who was making the tapes.
Yeah.
Well, anyways, this guy was making tapes for the FBI, going undercover, and he desperately wanted a deal to get out of prison early. And one way to do it is to get the truth of the Kennedy assassination. That should get me parole. So he volunteered to tape record Carlos. And what did Blakey say? They had like 30,000 hours of tape, and the one day he didn't turn the tape recorder on was the day that Carlos confessed. So take that for what it's worth. I'll tell you another interesting thing about Carlos Marcello. Most people know people who are into this story know that he went to prison for the Bry Lab, bribing a politician to pass some legislation about getting insurance for the state of. He did it as a favor, by the way. It wasn't for him, and it wasn't bribery. He went to prison, but not many people know that case was expunged. His record was cleared. He was released because Supreme Court realized that Carlos was right all along. It wasn't a bribe. He made a political contribution. Like anybody who makes a contribution, he asked for a favor for a friend, and that was enough to say, oh, you're a criminal. So his record is technically perfect, except for when he was a teenager, when he did some smuggling marijuana or something, selling dope. But he had a clean record. His bookmaking operation was so well run that the cops didn't even care about it. It was just a fact of life. It's New Orleans, laissez les bon temps rouler. That's a way of life. Big deal. Just Carlos. He never hurt a fly. That's what I heard all the time. Oh, Carlos, he never hurt a fly. So that's my experience with them. And if anybody knows differently, I say they haven't met the Marcellos.
Look, I get into this fight all the time when I mention some of this because they're all, oh, no, you don't understand. Marcello was a killer and he had Kennedy killed and he hated the Kennedys and Fred, you don't understand the mob and he controlled Dallas. Ruby worked for Marcello.
Yeah, I know. It's crazy. It's crazy. In fact, Joe, his son, even told me who helped him get back out of Guatemala, who took care of that flight and everything. And I don't know if I'm still yet at liberty to say, but it's a woman and she's still alive. And I went out to her place and met with her. And yeah, so that was nothing mysterious. Thinking of Ruby, mentioning him as knowing Marcello, which I don't believe he did. He might have had a couple interactions with him because Marcello controlled entertainment. He had a lot of he distributed liquor. I think he might have had something to do with the showgirls or something. But so you had to deal with Carlos because he was a power in the Southwest. Anyway, the idea of Ruby being hired by the mob to kill Oswald is beyond nuts. Here's a guy who was the biggest loudmouth in Dallas.
Yeah.
I mean, this guy was out of control, and his friends and associates all laugh when you mention that. I mean, they literally laugh when you say he's a mob hitman who took his dog to the Century, left his dog in the car, and as Bugliosi used to say, he said, "Well, if you're going to hire Ruby to kill Oswald, who are you going to hire to kill Ruby?"
Yeah, and also, I mean, here's another guy who, mafia hitman who happens to be selling twist boards and looking for the next big little thing to sell. It's sort of like Richard Case Nagel was. I talked to Richard Case Nagel's son, and he said he couldn't have been a CIA agent. We were so poor growing up; we had no money. Didn't the CIA pay people? Same thing with David Ferry. I mean, David Ferry was broke.
That's what I often say when people accuse people like you and I being working for the CIA because we think Oswald did it or we know Oswald did it. I say, well, I'm waiting for my paycheck. I'd love to have a CIA pension right now.
Well, apparently the CIA doesn't pay anybody because all these people were broke. I mean, it's absolutely amazing.
I know. It's part of it is because people do this quote unquote research long distance. And I get that part of it. Not everybody can afford to live in Miami or New Orleans or Dallas or wherever the action is. I got around that by finding publishers and TV networks to pay my bills. But that's the only way to do it. To really get to, and you do it. I applaud you because you spend your own nickel and travel all over and get as much firsthand as you possibly can. Yep. Who else is doing that? Quite regrettably, you weren't doing it back in the 80s and 90s when everybody was still around.
So look, Gus, I'm gonna end the interview, but I really want to again show your book again. That this is the book to get. I mean, people really need to read this because
so much.
They will. If you read this book, you're going to be really, really shocked because you're going to get the truth about what was going on between the Kennedys and the Castros, and it's going to wake you up from the conspiracy dream or nightmare that you're currently in. And so, Gus, thank you very much for doing the research, research.
Well, you're welcome. Thank you for appreciating it.
And bringing that to the public. And so thank you very much for appearing, and I'm sure we'll be back soon with a third interview.
If I've got anything left to say, I don't know, but I'll be happy to do it.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks, Fred.